then turn it over to Sam from Chinook Center.
Okay, great. So thanks, Amy. I am Sam Christiansen, and I'm with Chinook Center. Amy is also with Chinook Center, but I don't think someone should have to like introduce themselves when they're doing the work of the presentation. So I just wanted to come on here and kind of respectfully introduce both Amy and Stephanie. I know that this is part 2, so it feels a little bit like a repeat introduction, but actually it was my partner that did that introduction last week. So I'm gonna say this isn't repeat because it's coming from me. I'm getting a message that some people can't hear me. Can everyone else hear me? Yeah, okay. I'm just gonna go ahead and move through this, and then I think that maybe that audio will fix itself. So I just want to quickly go over the Chinook Center for folks that maybe didn't hear the intro last time or that are unfamiliar with us. The Chinook Center, I would kind of point out, is really what People's College aims to do in 2 forms. So it's hard to imagine right now because we're all just sitting in our houses, but the real goal of Chinook Center is to bring people together. So people that are working in grassroots movements and social justice movements that kind of have their own lanes. The Chinook Center's goal is to bring those lanes kind of together to share resources and amplify each other so that we're not always kind of, it's really easy to get locked into kind of like all of the work that goes into your own individual cause and to lose track of the kind of broader network that we all exist within. So People's College is one of the projects to do that, to bring all these skills and resources to a broad audience. And then the other aspect of Chinook Center is that we're in the process of trying to secure space that will kind of turn this collaboration into a kind of physical reality. So where there'll be a kind of centralized hub for the Pikes Peak region where grassroots organizers can have space to share for workspace and again, kind of mutual aid and resource sharing, but more importantly, to feel that physical community, to feel that kind of sense that we're all out here and we're doing this work, and sometimes this work can be really exhausting and kind of lonely. So the more that we can kind of come together and have shared identity and shared community, the better. So I don't want to like take up too much time on this. If you are unfamiliar with Chinook Center and you want to know more, please go to our website, chinookcenter.org, which you can see here. And then future People's College events are listed on our website. The next ones for this month will be April 21st and April 25th. So on the 21st, we're going to have, these will both obviously be online sessions again. On the 21st, we're going to have a session on cooperatives. And then on the 25th, we're going to have a presentation on the Chicano movement in Colorado. So both are going to be great presentations, and I will let the real professionals here on the subject get to it. So again, I thank Amy and Stephanie for their great work and for giving us their time and for sharing their knowledge with us. So thanks, guys.
Thank you so much, Sam. And I'll go ahead and introduce myself. I'm Amy, and I'm the volunteer coordinator at 350 Colorado and the mobilization organizer at Stop the Money Pipeline. And I will turn it over to Stephanie to introduce herself.
I'm Stephanie Bowman, and I'm with Mothers Out Front, and I'm the Pueblo and Colorado Springs Climate Justice Organizer. And if it sounds like a tree is getting cut down in my backyard, 30 minutes ago, my neighbors just decided to start cutting down their tree. So I apologize. All right, so in our first session, we had some homework. And so this is time to be honest. If you were able to do it, that would be great. But what we asked is for everyone to watch all the videos that are listed, to come ready to discuss the differences between an ally and accomplice, and to decide where you are now. What are you? And we understand this is a transitioning process. You aren't always in the same place, but this was our homework from last meeting. So this is also just, if this is your first time hearing about this, don't freak out, but it just gives you a little bit of perspective about how the beginning of this training is going to go.
All right. And meeting norms. These are just things that we'd like to share with everybody tonight so that we're all in a safe space, in a space where we feel like we can ask questions and be honest and explore how we are feeling. So be participatory, step back, step up, step back, unlearn and relearn, accountability, commit to self-transformation and self-introspection, ask questions, don't be shy and scared, we're here to help, impact over intent, derogatory statements and trolling will not be tolerated, you will be removed from the session. Be aware of your language or simply ask, call out and gently call in. Don't forget to mute when you're not talking so we don't hear the background noise. Meet people where they are. And what can we imagine to be different and be different? Lead with love and commit to healing. We all need to heal. All right, so this is where we're gonna jump in the chat. Or if you're on the phone and unable to access the chat, go ahead and come off mute and share. But this is a section about, we're asking, why don't you like to talk about racism? So pop it in the chat or put yourself on stack and come off mute. Hadima?
So one of the things that I realized was happening to me was that I lived in such a privileged little bubble that sometimes when I see another mixed couple, it kind of startles me because I don't think of myself as being a mixed couple. So I realized that I think I've been discriminated more for being a woman than for being a person of color. You know, as far as, you know, less pay, less promotions, you know, those kind of things. But it troubles me that I've been so protected.
Thank you, Hadima. Anybody else want to come off mute or go ahead and share in the chat?
I'll go ahead and go.
Go, Robin.
You know, after watching the video and seeing and hearing other white people talk about why they don't like to talk about race, you know, I agreed with a lot of the things that people were saying. Not that I liked what they were saying, but that it is a hard thing to talk about because you don't want to offend somebody, because you don't want to hurt somebody's feelings, that you don't want to admit that you might have some that you might have some racial bias, even though it's something that has been instilled in us from the time we were born, that we learned when we were kids. And sometimes that's a hard thing to think about. And, you know, it's definitely something that I would like it to be more easy to talk about. Because after watching all 4 of the videos and hearing what everybody had to say, it all just is so sad and frustrating that people haven't been more honest about that for a long time, because we would be in a lot better place if we could all just be more honest with each other.
Thank you very much, Robin, for sharing. And don't be shy to come off mute.
Hey,
Or-
this is Sam Allen. Can
Hi,
you guys
Sam.
hear me?
Yes.
So I was thinking about how racism is this tool of imposing violence and operates culturally and institutionally. We don't like to acknowledge that violence exists. So part of not wanting to talk about it is to deny it. Another way, people try to make it invisible in ways. And when it does happen, then it's fully rationalized. And then we think when people lower on a hierarchy try to fight back, it's usually regarded with shock. And so trying to think, how does racism play into the larger culture of people holding power or abusing other people or land bases?
Thank you so much for sharing.
That's great, Sam. I mean, applause.
Yeah, so what do you guys think? Part of this talk is interesting because it's both about 350 Colorado and environmental issues, and that's how I see it relating with racism and environmental issues.
I think that perhaps, at least for me, we don't get an opportunity to, this is Barbara, to actually speak, you know, like, I think I express myself much better, especially get to know a person, right? To look folks in the eye and talk about a subject, as opposed to perhaps getting caught in the, you know, reactionary words maybe that are posted in, as people are chatting about something or in the news, you know. I don't think we get an opportunity to share ideas and thoughts like just now has happened, which of course, as community, as communication, as talking through, oh, I just learned this word maybe I shouldn't use, we all grow through that. And I do think that for the most part, yes, of course, I think, yes, Sam, it's the head of the nail is very often it's people needing to put their foot on something to feel like they have a power.
That's awesome. Thank you so much, Barbara. All right. Anybody else? Or I'm gonna jump in our next slide and hand it over to Stephanie. All right.
Hello, everyone. So the important part about this next section is really as we're going through what some of these common definitions and terms are, you can put any questions that you have in the chat. If you're like, oh, I already thought ally meant this. Because we all are living these experiences and we're creating this curriculum as we build it with folks. And to also just reflect on what are you currently. And if you have any questions, like I said, just feel free to put in the chat. All right, so what is positionality? Positionality is every position or identity or social, economic, political location that you hold. So have you all heard of positionality before? And where have you heard it? And you can feel free to just share or put it in the chat. No one?
Hello?
Okay. Yes. Micah?
Yes, I'm here.
Welcome, welcome. I think you just popped on and we were just getting started, so you came in at the perfect time. Are you just
Gotcha.
on your phone?
Yeah, just doing it on the phone. Thanks for accepting me, guys.
Oh, okay, perfect. So just mute yourself. That way if there's any background noise and when you want to speak or anything, you can just unmute yourself.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. All right, so the question was, what is positionality? And so Mia says, yes, at work and in my community organizing work, we have called this our specifically in our community organizing work outside of paid work. Yeah, I really don't understand what you mean. If you are able to come off mute, that would be helpful. Okay. Amy, can you go to the next slide? Okay. All right. No, it's fine. Okay, so positionality. So here's just an illustration for those of you that can't see because you just called in, that's fine. It's a little graphic of a stick figure in the middle, and around it are different lines that say occupation, sexuality, geographic location, age, ability, income, gender, immigration status, heritage, history, language, religion, ethnicity, race, education, and so on and so on. And so if you think of yourself as the stick figure in the middle of the page, what is your positionality? And it's really important for you to think about this before we start going into ally and accomplice, because your positionality really impacts that.
I'm gonna go ahead and go.
All right. And,
So
okay, go ahead.
So are you wanting to hear from us what all of those other things around us are? Or is there like a term for what all of those things are together? I guess I'm still trying to learn that because I have not heard this term before. I understand, you know, what it shows, but I don't know if you're wanting us to say, like, this is, you know, what my heritage is. This is where I work. This is how much I make. Is that what you're looking for?
On the earlier slide, I was, but just because of the sake of time, I just went ahead and moved on and just kind of defined it. But I was hoping, you know, someone would, but if you wanted to share what your positionality is, that would be helpful.
Okay. So I am, does that include age? I don't have the chart in front of me right now.
Yes.
Okay. So I'm a middle-aged white female. I am a retail manager for a small men's big and tall store in Colorado Springs. And I have done some activist work with an anti-war organization. And I am a treasurer for a poetry organization. Is that kind of like what you were looking for?
I was just looking for your positionality. I wasn't looking for anything in particular, and you did list a lot of the things on there. So yeah, that's fine. Marnice put in the chat. Thank you, Robin. Marnice put in the chat: occupation, education, ability, language, geographic location, and age. Mia put in: I'm a cisgender female, middle class, middle-aged woman, born and raised in USA, both parents of Mexican, Puerto Rican heritage. English is my first language, and I'm currently able-bodied, Catholic, and I have a graduate degree. My family is well known in the area for their careers in the Air Force, education, and a judge. So that's a very good all the way around the spectrum description of your positionality.
Okay. Have we
Yes,
moved from
June?
the, well, we've moved from the other chart, so can we go back to the former chart for just a second?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Okay. My race is African American. I'm of the Catholic religion. I speak English. My heritage is African American out of Harlem, New York. My education is I'm a graduate of UCCS. My occupation has been many things, raising a family, being a military wife. When I got a divorce, then I knew it was important to raise 3 daughters. So my sexuality is heterosexual, and my age is 83. Now the bottom ones, geographical location, ability, income, gender, those things became important, I would say, after I turned 40. And you would need a little book to get that between 40 and 83. But I think if we're talking about how uncomfortable race is, I believe we really need to hear different stories of how race affected people's lives and how people accept things. You know how communication is? It can start with you, and by the time it gets to the 10th person, it has taken on a life of its own. So we really need to be able to tell your story that people will start to listen, because right now we're talking past each other. I don't know if it's just the American way, but we're not listening to each other, and we've been at this for like, well, I've been here 83 years. Seems like we've been at this for 83 years. Things are looking better, but I don't feel they're much better when you look at 83 years, you know. I was here in World War II when my dad went into the military. I was here for the father of our current president, because he was in New York while we were in Harlem, and he did some damage there. I'm saying to you, the longer you live, I think you experience opportunity as well as experience of heartbreak. Being especially a person of color, you just experience so many different things that you just don't have time to write them down. But no, thanks. Oh, I'm through. I'm going back to mute.
Thank you so much for that. Does anyone else want to share before we move on? I just want to give that space. Okay.
June is
All right,
right.
so this,
I mean, other than June is right, yes.
thank you, Barbara. So this next slide, for those of you that can't see, is kind of difficult to explain, but it's circles, the outer ring of circles with inner circles in the inside. And this just is another illustration of positionality with a layer of privilege surrounding it on the outside, just really explicitly. So if you see marginalized folks are in the middle, but as you define marginalized, it breaks them into groups such as people with disabilities, people of color, women, girls, transgender, queer, gender nonconforming, financially poor, working class, LGBTQ, children, youth, older adults, non-native English speakers, non-Christians. And so in this graphic in particular, all of that is considered to be a part of a marginalized group. The outer ring are these privileged groups. So those are people without disability, white people, boys, men, cisgender people, wealthy homeowners, upper to middle class, heterosexual, straight, adults, 18 to 65, native English speakers, and Christians. And so there's arrows that are going in between these. And so when we think about our positionality and when we think about privilege, these are the forces that you feel. So it's emotional abuse. When privileged groups use their status, when they are blaming and minimizing Black people's lived experience, the people of color's lived experience, using knowledge of systems. So like, you know, the system that is oppressive and you're intentionally using it. Our president's very good at this. Using it for your own private good, emotional abuse, intimidation and threats, economic abuse, so preventing folks to be able to own property and redlining communities and things like that. Yeah, so that's pretty much the second graphic. So Amy, can you change the slide? And if anyone has any questions, just let me know. This is more so to kind of bring in privilege in regards to your positionality.
Yep. And so our next question is, what is privilege? Who has privilege? And if you just want to pop in the chat your definition of privilege and or who has privilege, just so we can get that thinking going. I will model. Mia says unearned rights and access to certain benefits based on aesthetics. Inherited wealth. The wealthy having power over others. Who is surviving COVID-19. Speaking English well, higher education, give you privilege. These are great examples. Who gets to shelter in place? That's an excellent example. And I think we've all been having the conversation of how ironic it is that our frontline workers are the same people that they didn't want to pay a decent living wage to, who are now keeping our society's fabric held together. Julie says, I have lots of privilege being able to be the norm or the dominant in almost any circumstance or environment I am in. That's excellent to recognize. And Jack says, not getting profiled by police, customs officials. True that. These are all excellent. You guys are amazing. All right. So we're going to move on to our next slide. And this is a short video on how does white privilege work. And I'm going to go ahead and see if this works to play it. And hopefully you guys can hear it. Let me know if you can't. And we'll just move on. You guys can watch it later because I'm screen shared. I'm not sure how this is going to work. I don't think it's going to let me play it while I'm screen sharing. Okay. So
I can just send it in the chat.
Yeah, I was going to say send it in the chat. And then I can see.
Pardon me, what was the script that appeared for 2 seconds and disappeared?
It did what?
To the left. We had a script that appeared on the left-hand side of the screen, and then it disappeared before you had an opportunity to read the whole thing. Or I'm a slow reader. Did anyone else see something on
that may be your chat box.
Oh,
So are there 3 dots on the bottom right of your screen
not anymore.
that say more? Okay.
Okay.
If you move your cursor over where like it says stop video mute, you'll see something 3 dots. If you click that, there we go, and select chat.
Yeah, I think the slide advanced really fast when she was trying to play the video, and then she went back. So maybe
Okay.
June saw the next slide.
Yeah, okay, thanks.
Okay. Thank you for that. We can't hear anything. I don't know if it's just me.
No, it's all of us, I think.
The sound's not working. Somebody had a suggestion to put it into a different window to see if I could get it to play.
Hey, Stephanie, this is Marnice. Tell her to share the computer, her computer, computer sound. It's in settings. I can't see it on my computer.
Okay, let me
But
see. Sorry about this.
So like in the bottom right?
The bottom
Okay.
of Zoom, the bottom of Zoom. It says share computer sound, your computer.
No, I don't see that.
That's Amy. If she's sharing her screen, she should be able to share her computer sound. I think it's under the tab with the settings for recording and all that.
Okay, I'm looking for it. It's not happening.
I'm sorry to hijack. I just wanted to help.
No, thank you. I appreciate that so much. I don't
see it.
Yeah, it's not, I don't know, my Zoom doesn't have that. Okay, well, we'll leave it for us to watch later, and I will jump back into sharing the slides. And just give me 1 second. Okay. Sorry
There
about
we
that,
are.
y'all. Okay. So. Okay, so what is white privilege? White privilege is the idea that white people in America have certain advantages that people of color do not have. White people can choose not to think about race, and white privilege does not imply that white people do not have to work hard for, or that everything is just handed to them. White people often don't have to worry about certain issues that people of color do. White people can travel to any city, move into any neighborhood, attend any school, feel comfortable at any place of employment, and shop at pretty much any store without harassment. White people can see like them in leadership positions across the board, from politics to workplaces, and they can choose to interact only with other white people. Okay, and then examples of these privileges that they are freedoms inherently afforded to white people, you know, but not me. Some people struggle with the topic of white privilege because they think it doesn't apply to them. White privilege does not imply that white people do not have to work hard for everything or that everything is handed to them. It's about economic status or a life of ease. A person can have white privilege if he's never been the only one of his race in his school, at a job, at an event, has never been called a racial slur, or never had to wonder if being treated a certain way because of his race All right, would anyone like to volunteer to read this slide? Somebody want to jump in and read?
I'll read it, maybe.
Go ahead.
White privilege is not something you caused that you personally need to be ashamed of, but it is something to be aware of and not perpetuate. When white people recognize that they were born with an inherent privilege, they can use that to understand the racial climate and be aware and honor the experiences of others.
Thank you very much. No one is asking you to apologize for being white. No one is asking you to apologize for the sins of your ancestors. What we are asking is that you help dismantle the oppressive systems that they built.
All right, so with that statement, moves us right into Accomplice. So when we think about Accomplice, usually it has like a negative connotation, but why is that? Amy, can you change the next slide? So Accomplice often has gotten a bad rep and is equated with wrongdoing. But Accomplice means being willing to act with and for oppressed peoples and accepting the potential fallout from doing so. Accomplice is taking a lot of risk, putting your body on the line, sacrificing your own safety because you know that there is a moral obligation. So often when I talk about Accomplice, I like to talk about legality and morality, because it's really important to understand that, just like here in this image, a friendly reminder, the Holocaust was legal, slavery was legal, segregation was legal. All of these oppressive systems were legal. Hiding Jews was criminalized. So there were accomplices who risked themselves, who risked breaking laws because of the conflict of morality. Freeing slaves was criminalized. Protesting racism was criminalized. And there's a long list of things that we can still list right now that are criminalized that we as activists often fight against, and we are, in some cases, some of us are accomplices. And so when we think about accomplice, and before we get lost into the word of ally, it's really important to remind yourself that the basis of it is the willing to act with and for oppressed people and accepting that fallout. Next slide. So it's important to remember that in order to be an accomplice, one must be willing to do more than listen. You must be willing to stand with those who are being attacked, excluded, or otherwise mistreated. And even if that means suffering personal or professional backlash. Next slide. So ally. When I think of ally, I often like to think of like a three-legged race. So I don't know how many of you all have been in a race, three-legged race with someone, and they were trying to run the opposite direction as you, okay? Both of your legs were connected, but you all have a different plan. One's trying to run super fast, the other one's trying to pace themselves, and it's counterproductive to what you're trying to do. Often, when people of color pair up with allies, we feel that tug where we want to move forward, but the strategies in which and the privilege and the positionality has made it where we're pulling ourselves in different directions. So an ally means to support. And the second part of the definition, they support those who which they have a common interest. And so in our last training, when we were talking about implicit bias, and we're talking about the unconscious bias that we have, when we talk about common interest, it makes it difficult if we have this unconscious bias to be a true ally if our common interest is bias in itself. So often when folks use ally, it's for some sort of transactional need, right? Like, oh, we have this common good, this is something that I want out of it. So when we think of someone who is supportive, someone who is in our side, someone who has our back, what does that really mean? It takes more than support to make a difference, right? Like, white people claim to support the principles of diversity, equity, and inclusion, but few are courageous enough to put their own jobs on the line by speaking out against prejudice and discrimination in the workplace. And so there's an excellent quote by Lila Watson on needs for actors to shift to being accomplices. And it says, if you have come here to help me, you're wasting your time. If you have come here because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together. All right. So I know I kind of went through those pretty quickly, but this is just a little activity that we can do just to see if you have any questions or if you were able to process the difference between ally versus accomplice. So I broke down like fragments of all different ways in which you can be an ally or an accomplice. So in your protesting and your actions, and how you spend your money, in your community. If you are a white person that wants to be ally or accomplice, this would be in your white communities, in your advocacy, in your job, in your time. And so as I'm listing these through, if you are able to think of an example right off the top of your head of what you feel like an ally would do versus an accomplice for each. So it can be with your vote, interrupting violence, your self-education, your children, your art, and your home. So an example would be like in your art, I would say an ally is someone who would buy all different types of art, but may buy them from second or third party vendors if they are people of color or marginalized folks. Whereas an accomplice would be someone who may plan a large event with marginalized folks that are artists to ensure that they could have a direct person-to-person interaction or transaction without them having to be the middle party, like just creating like a system because they want to fight systems of oppression. So that's an example of what it would be with art. So Jackie O said protesting. An ally would be like sharing on social media, whereas an accomplice would be attending and organizing the protest. Correct. That's perfect. Does anyone else have any examples?
I would like to see if this is correct. And on your money, an ally would be a person who would hold, if you feel something is wrong, like a television show, dealing with the people who support that show, you would not buy the products that they produce. And an accomplice, you would go to those shows that have people who support the same ideas that you would have. So do I have that backwards?
No, what I heard was you said that a ally would, can you repeat it again? I just want to make sure.
Okay, an ally would be someone that you would support you would buy the products that keep them on the air. But an accomplice would be, you would not, or you would try to get others to do the same thing. But it sounds like I'm coming from the same point of view.
Yeah, I would say I would take it a step further because it's about like stopping the system of oppression, like, and which is risky, right? Like when we step up to fight a major system, that is where like the most risk is. So it would be like if there was a television show, it would be attacking the network, like directly doing social media posts or like using your personal Facebook account, where you're actually going over the system that creates the show.
Mm-hmm.
Another good example of like kind of what you're talking about, like your money and like the art and things like that is a lot of people will buy native indigenous themed art at like Bed Bath or Target or Walmart. And these things, you know, are one, they're sacred. And the people that make them, if you're going to spend your money, spend it with an indigenous artist, someone who made that indigenous art. So you're putting the money back into the community.
Any other examples? Because I really would like.
I think I have one, Stephanie and Amy, for your job, but I'm still not quite sure. So for your job, an ally, say if your job have a diversity, equity, and inclusion statement, ally will make sure that they have like these different statements at the beginning of the meetings. An accomplice will make sure that the organization is putting into practices on how to do diversity, equity, and inclusion work. In the work, they will make sure that ensure that staff of color get equitable pay, or staff who needs, for example, childcare, equitable, what's that, insurance and things of that nature, or make sure that you have people of color affinity groups so you can organize and advocate for things and policies that may impact people of color or people who are not on the hierarchy, the people on the bottom. Is that a good example?
Absolutely. Like the best one.
Because the key point to remember here is that an ally may necessarily work with the system to show an action or do something to fight against the system, whereas primarily like an accomplice wants to create a way, like an example Marnice gave, like to create a way to make it more equitable. So if it is about making spaces diverse, or if it's about raising or spending money in certain communities, often an ally has to be the middle person for it to happen. But the benefit of an accomplice is about creating that infrastructure that's outside of a system of oppression that you've created to make a marginalized group more sustainable, right? And it's not about you having to be the middle person. I saw that someone put voting. Most of the time we are allies supporting issues like healthcare, electric cars, housing, but just vote. The accomplice goes canvassing and is part of an organization that may organize a coalition or a land trust. Yeah. Being arrested for protesting at Wells Fargo that supports pipelines. So that would definitely be an accomplice action. Because there's a lot of risk entailed. You're going through a system of oppression. And if you are a person of privilege, you're using your privilege to fight against the system of oppression. Let's see. Sarah said ally in voting could be voting for better quality air for all, but an accomplice would be helping communities around big ag facilities where their water, soil, and air are being drastically affected, which are usually where people of color live. Yes. Some people, when they talk about allying accomplice, they include the word actor. And often folks will put voting, passive voting in the actor phase. So like you may not do anything at all related to the work, but you just vote every 4 years. That may be considered more of being an actor because you aren't necessarily doing any action at all for marginalized folks. Whereas an ally may do something like they may attend a tea or a round table or a webinar with marginalized folks and people of color because they acknowledge that they want to do this work, but they're not necessarily trying to fight a system of oppression, like head on. Does anyone have any other examples or anything that they want to throw out there?
I see Mariah on Stack.
Yeah, so it's not exactly like a concrete example, but, and feel free, I mean, if this is completely off base, but I often think about that the difference between them is essentially being the difference between like sympathy and empathy, because like empathy is like, you know, really trying to understand somebody's position and like, you know, wanting to rectify that, you know, taking steps, even if it's like even if you're benefiting from it, whereas sympathy is still essentially just kind of like looking down and like, I mean, you recognize that there's a problem, but you're not really actively taking steps to like overturn that system, and it's still kind of very like oppressive in nature. So anyway, that's just always the way I've kind of thought about it, is just like an ally might be sympathetic and they might be like, oh yeah, that's an issue, and do like kind of band-aids, whereas an accomplice will be empathetic and actually try to kind of, yeah, like, you know, disrupt the oppressive system.
Yeah. Is that what you do when you agree? That's great. Okay.
Here, I think that's a really good point, because it goes back to that morality aspect of it. Is there are some folks who are more sympathetic to certain type of people that they view more human, right? And we just have to like acknowledge that there are those folks. And so it is okay to pollute in their communities, just like it is okay to send less ventilators in those communities, just like it's okay to not have enough tests in those communities. And so it's like this intersection of like, I like sympathy and empathy, but also it's like this death and morality, because there's a lot of loss of life when it comes to systems of oppression. And I feel like a lot of people wear these labels of being an ally or accomplice, but it really, the explicitness of being an accomplice is like this fighting for morality and like what that looks like. But I really like the sympathy versus empathy, because everyone's morality is different based off of your cultural background. Does anyone else have any other examples before we move on? Has this been helpful for folks to kind of see the differences?
I wanted to add, oh, I'm sorry, about the children. Like a lot of families donate clothes and stuff like that, you know, for homeless people. But I like to have my granddaughter come with me when we do a distribution. So they get to meet people. They get to see that, you know, they're not less than us. They're not bad people. They're not somebody to be scared of. Somebody that needs help. So I'm making an accomplice of her.
Yes, and we need generations of those. Thank you for that. And I would definitely like to point out the most important thing about an ally is that they work from their space of comfort, right? And so if it's working within your network, if you are planning a protest, it may be, oh, I want to have all these different diverse people a part of the protest because of what they represent, but not necessarily all of them being at the same table. A system of oppression, someone who will be fighting against a system of oppression, and they were planning that same protest, would actually create a table, a round table of all these different representatives of these communities and let them participate in the planning process of building that event. And so an ally would just be like, okay, here's my list. Let's just call these people, check them off, make sure they're there. Whereas Accomplice would be really explicit in saying, hey, even if I'm not here next year, I want there to be a system in place where it can consistently be diverse.
All right, so we're gonna move on to what is whiteness. And last week we talked about we had that little session where we talked about what are you proud of most about your own race. And it came to like a wall, and people were afraid, you know, they either, you know, were a little uncomfortable or didn't know how to share something, you know, even as a white person, like something that you're proud of. And so when Stephanie and I were debriefing about this and talking about this, it really hit hard that, you know, that we needed to lift up how people of European descent automatically identify with the white race, like as a default. And so when we were talking about implicit bias, like, and your own identification, you know, and it running unchecked and unacknowledged in yourself. And when we were talking about this, I used the example of the other half of my heritage, which is Hungarian, and how I identify as that. And then, you know, at the other side, because I'm proud of certain things that my family did to, you know, fight in the Hungarian Revolution. And I grew up, I spent a lot of summers in Hungary. So finding that place where you can unpack that and figure out, you know, where you identify. All right, so then whiteness is a hegemonic system that perpetuates certain dominant ideologies about who receives power and privilege. Whiteness maintains itself in cultures through power dynamics within language, religion, class, race relations, sexual orientation, and so on. All right. So this is where we're going to move into a little bit of talking about some white fragility and some white tears. And this is definitely can be a difficult conversation, but I want everyone in this space to know that you are safe to be vulnerable here and to really unpack what's going on for you. Like, this group is here to support you. Just reading comments. Okay. So have you been, as a white person, corrected by a person of color, and how did you take it? What was your initial reaction? And this is for the white folks on the call, if you're comfortable. And if you're not, that's okay too. If anyone is okay with sharing.
I'm sorry, are we answering the question on the screen? Is that right?
Yes. Okay,
sorry. Yeah, I have been corrected by a person of color before. And it was uncomfortable, but I was so grateful. It felt like an honor to receive feedback rather than being dismissed or just not. It just felt like a gift that they took the time to do that, knowing that it could be very uncomfortable for them too. So I appreciated it. I hope that my attitude, that they could sense my attitude as receptive to it. That's probably very, very hard to, you offer that correction, it could be weaponized too against you if you're offering that. So yeah, I don't know, that was my experience, has been my experience several times.
Thank you so much for taking the time to share that and to be comfortable with sharing that. Does anyone else?
I'll go ahead and say something.
Go ahead, Robin.
I have a dear friend who posts a lot of topics about this on their Facebook page, where there's a lot of conversation around it. And, you know, the thing that is great is that there are times where that person will put something up there and will say something, and at first you might feel like, oh man, have I ever done that to somebody before? I don't think that I've ever had somebody like one-on-one come to me and do that, but I really like to go to that person's Facebook page and be part of the dialogue on it, just so that it gives me more of an awareness if there's something that I've done. Because there are times where something will come up and be like, oh wow, did I do that to somebody before? So it just makes me more aware of you know, what that perspective is, and learning from it and being able to have conversation with other people about it as well.
Thank you so much, Robin, for sharing. Does anyone else want to share before we move on? Kadima?
I want to expand this, that it doesn't have to be white facing a person of color, because in my case, it was more being educated as a person of color, that I did not know things about Native American culture or practices, that even though we're all put together as people of color, that there are things that we don't know about each other, and we definitely need to learn things from each other. Yeah, this whole issue of ally, I was in such shock, because I thought that being present was enough, not understanding the issues and the problems that the other person was having. So it's not just white on white versus people of color. It's all different kinds of groups of people that we need to be able to learn from their experiences. Okay.
Thank you, Harima, so much. And I was hoping that someone would dive into that space. And I really appreciate you being the one to do that, because it is true, you know, that we do it to each other, you know, not knowing sometimes from our culture to the next culture. And even as a person of color, you can, from one person of color to the next. So anybody else want to share before we move on? All right. So, white fragility. Why does this bother me? Develop an understanding of white fragility and white tears, how they perpetuate harm against people of color. Reflect and recognize when it is happening, either by you or someone you're with. And develop strategies to interrupt white fragility and white tears. All right, so white fragility. White people in North America live in a social environment that protects and insulates them from race-based stress. This insulated environment of racial protection builds white expectations for racial comfort, while at the same time lowering the ability to tolerate racial stress, leading to what we refer to as white fragility. White fragility is the state in which even a minimum amount of racial stress becomes intolerable, triggering a range of defensive moves. These moves include the outward display of emotions, such as anger, fear, guilt, and behaviors such as being argumentative, silence, and leaving the stress-inducing situation, completely walking away. And these behaviors, in turn, function to reinstate white racial equilibrium. All right, so now we're going to take a poll, and for 1 second here, I am going to, Stephanie, could you share the slide deck in the chat so people can vote?
Yes, I can do that.
Awesome. All right, so in the chat, Stephanie, if you're able to, if you're on a computer, and you can jump in and vote, you just hit the little blue vote button down here, and it'll click on a little link, and it'll open up. Oh no, this form can, well, either way, something's going on with the form. I apologize for the tech issues. It says the form is outside of the organization. So we're gonna take a poll in the chat, and we'll talk about some results. So your choices are and you can use numbers. Number 1, I'm not white, it's annoying. 2, all white people aren't bad. 3, I don't see color. 4, I don't want to talk about racism. 5, this makes me uncomfortable. or 6 other, and you can list that.
We'll give everyone 2 minutes.
And then I'll share results as they come in to the chat. So just in numerical order. You can pop a number into the chat. All right, I see 2 number 1s, a number 5, which is this makes me uncomfortable, and then a number 6, and whoever's at the Tree Pose Cooperative Zoom account, if you want to come off mute and share your other reason, you can if you're comfortable.
Sure, I will. Let me see. Yeah, I'm kind of in the middle of painting a room, so I had to.
Sorry.
So, but what I will say is, not necessarily. I felt like number 1 was close, but not quite. I didn't want to say it's annoying. What I wanted to say is that, at least in my experiences, it's been something that is, when I see it, it's usually that sobering moment that happens sometimes when I encounter people and I'm explaining something that no one's ever said it to them like that before, or they haven't been able to identify someone's pain outside of their own before. And so when they have that sobering moment and they let go of emotion and things like that, I'm like, well, that's great that we got in contact with that empathy and that compassion. But after you do that, what I'd like to see you do is figure out what do you think some next steps could be, because I don't need to necessarily tell you what next steps. I can give you some resources to like educate yourself, but as far as what you're going to do as a person, I can't tell you that. But what I can suggest that, you know, you just think about what it is that you desire in life and how do you want to go about it, because I think that in all of what we encounter person to person, as far as racism and discrimination and prejudice goes person to person, has a lot to do with what we desire in life and how we want to go about it. So if people desire the American dream, right, and they want to go about it by being accepted and taking all of the privileges that come along with this concept of whiteness, right? So some people are going to do that and they're going to have no shame, no remorse. They don't care. Like, look, that's the way the game is played. I'm playing it, right? So that's fine. That's what you want to do. But if you're a person that can look at that and say, hey, I don't think that that's right. That's obviously not fair. That's obviously something that needs to change. Well, then you got to figure your next steps, right? I'm not here to tell you what your next step, but you need to figure out who you want to be as a person. And the best I can do is give you some information to educate you. And, you know, maybe you can get a deeper intellectual understanding of all of what happens, like economically, socially, politically, so on and so forth. So that's all I want to say.
Thank you very much. Appreciate your sharing. All right, and then I see in the chat a 3. I don't see color. Another 6. Mia says the lack of recognition, the privilege to not have to respond, react, be accountable, or engage. Other doesn't mean every white person. 6, I don't know how to talk about it with others. That conversation makes me uncomfortable. And another 5. Okay, that's good. See, this is good that we're recognizing that we're feeling uncomfortable and that things are hard.
There's still some people who didn't vote. So there's 16 people on here and I only have 9. So it will be very helpful to get an assessment before we go into the next section.
But I can't vote. I hit vote And
Oh,
it
just
does nothing.
So what number, which one
I
describes you,
don't
June?
see color. Somehow, just soon as that leaks from the mouth, my brain does this topsy-turvy, and you don't want to insult people, but I don't believe there's a person in the United States that don't see color. I just don't. So if we start out there, it's hard even participating in the conversation, because I do believe that that's the wall between us, that folks do see color. Black people, red people, white people, they see color first. And then we have to figure out how to break that barrier and talk after that. That would be my number one. Is that what you're asking?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, that would be my number one. I'm not white, it's annoying. That would be my last one. All white people aren't bad. That would be my number three, maybe. And I don't want to talk about racism. Talking about racism never makes me uncomfortable. I look in the mirror every day. That doesn't make me uncomfortable. But when you come into the conversation with statements like, I don't see color, it says, well, then we have nothing really to talk about. I can't communicate with you because I see color. So.
I feel like I got the voting
Thank you.
wrong.
Go ahead.
I'm sorry, I feel like I got the voting wrong, but that's okay. Yeah.
No worries. All right, does anybody else want to chime in with a vote? All right. Okay, so we're gonna translate all this. So white fragility is white people not being able to tolerate discussions about the existence of racism, being told what they said, did, wrote was racist and hurtful. The concept that impact is over intent. Like you will say, oh, well, I didn't intend on, that hurting your feelings. And that you have to think about ahead of time what the impact is going to be on someone before you open your mouth. And then responding, especially out loud, with defensiveness, deflection, guilt, hurt, anger, and white tears. When white people use their emotions as a weapon against people of color, it's a form of white supremacy. One way to combat white supremacy is with humor. Obviously, there's a place for anger and outrage and protest and resistance, but all those things. But I think sometimes humor is a necessary tool. And I follow him on Twitter. Y'all should definitely follow this man on Twitter. Wise man. All right. White tears. Let's talk about some white tears.
Okay, white tears. So my background is I've been a political activist in battleground states for the past 10 to 15 years. And I've experienced white tears consistently throughout my life in correcting folks for the behavior in meetings, in town halls, and volunteer spaces, all of the bias, microaggressions, macroaggressions, explicit racism, sexism, and often white tears tend to be a trigger word when I use it with folks, like, oh, okay, so you're crying. Like, so just to give a common definition, white tears is a phrase that's been used to gently tease white people who get upset at things that they think threaten their white privilege. It can be and is meant to be a way to poke fun at white people who think that talking about race makes you racist, and that they don't consider your positionality in your place of power in the idea that you can be racist. And often those are spaces where you'll hear a person of color correct someone, and then they'll call the person of color racist. And often a gentle, because I'm kind of a person that leads with humor. I feel like that's my survival trait that was passed down from my ancestors, that we often deflect from trauma with humor. And for me, I have found that calling out folks who decide to cry because I have pushed or questioned their positionality and their privilege, call it out, say it's white tears, because it means that you are in a place of privilege where you believe that your tears give you comfort and a right to exist in a safe space while attacking mine. And so as we think about white tears, it really kind of brings us into the idea of around assumptions and how there's often all of these preconceived notions around like your age or your gender and your race and your positionality, right? And so that can either be from your employers, from your managers, from people in your church, from your community. It could be specifically white males who may just use a certain tone or pitch or diction when they speak to you and compared to their counterparts. I've witnessed a lot of that. But when it comes to perceived failure, there is this feeling when people of color, Black people, I can only speak for my space, when we enter into spaces and there's assumptions made, like if I speak and articulate, then it's like, oh, you speak well. Or there's like this preconceived assumption that I wouldn't speak well, right? And like that's how I translate it when someone says it, where their intent may have been that it was a compliment. In fact, it's a microaggression, and it's, some people are very explicit. So I just wanted to give you this time to think about, has someone ever assumed you couldn't do something? And you can feel free, if you want to share it in the chat, that's fine. I know it's personal, you don't have to. This is unlearning and unpacking. But once you think about if they ever assumed something you couldn't do, why? Why do you think they assumed that? So for me, it's like, I know they assumed I couldn't speak well because when they looked at me, they're like, oh, okay, this is what I'm used to people who look like her to talk like. So I'm going to make an assumption that she's going to talk like this. Go ahead.
I'm going to add some humor to this thing. I went to rent a four-wheel drive car in Panama one time, and I went through all the paperwork, signed everything, and then when they went to give me the keys, they looked at me like, with my height, I couldn't possibly drive that big car. And I'm very sensitive to my height. I always wished I would get to be 5 feet tall, but I never got there. So I drove off in this big car, not knowing where any of the buttons were for anything, but I was not gonna show those men that I could not drive that car. So I pulled up about a block away in a parking area to try to figure out what the buttons were for opening the windows or turning the air conditioner on or anything. But I just, yeah, infuriated me. So that's my little disability. I'm vertically challenged.
Thank you for that. I understand, especially when it comes to driving in vehicles. There's a lot of assumptions made, especially as women as well, like, oh, you know, women can't drive, or so they say.
And yes, along the same lines, having been a woman in technology and in business where I really found that where they wanted me was to teach people how all the technology worked, but they certainly didn't want you out there being the front lines, making the commissions, that kind of thing. I know it's not as big as many of the other challenges that people have to face, which I think is why we try to go become, you know, an ally and learn how to be an accomplice, you know.
Thank you for that, Barbara. And the thing about this preconceived failure is that often, as being different variants from different marginalized groups, we experience this layered preconceived failure, where we often feel all these mosquito bites all day of assumptions that people make about us, about how we exist in this space. So no matter how small or big you think it may be, it definitely can pile up and make us react and behave in ways that may not be how we want to behave. I see someone shared, yeah, the female driver thing. I remember guys being super impressed that I can drive sticks. Yes, that is definitely a real thing. Saying me too. And so there are these preconceived failures. And so it's often important that when we think about being an ally and an accomplice, that we have to check, we have to reflect on the preconceived failure that people have made about us to allow us to identify how we may also have preconceived failure against other people. And so as someone who has 4 Black men as brothers, I often witness white women fear my brothers. I'm the baby. They are chocolate Black men. So I always witness the world through my layer of privilege and how white people were automatically afraid of my brothers. And so for me, the preconceived failure can be something just as simple as assuming someone may be a criminal, assuming that someone may harm you, getting in the elevator and clenching your purse when you see a person of color compared to a white male. And so it's just important when we think about ally and accomplice, and we've worked through white privilege and white fragility and white tears, and we go all the way down here to preconceived failure. It's easier to make us acknowledge all the wrong that's happened to us because we identify our victimness, right? That's our positionality. But we have to reflect on our own lived experience for us to stop ourselves from using implicit bias and being unconscious in our behavior. And there's many women that I have corrected who've clenched their purse against my brothers or have called the police because they were walking through our neighborhood. And it would always go to, well, I didn't know, it wasn't, I thought they were threatening. And I always have to be like, what did they do to make you think they were threatening? Oh, they were existing. And so it's really important, especially my white folks on the call who really want to be allies and shift to being accomplices, you need to acknowledge your preconceived assumptions about other folks. And not being aware is not okay anymore. And I really believe the universe has given us time for us to spend a lot of time self-reflecting on how we interact with each other, so that when we go into these spaces in person together, we can be more intentional in how we communicate and in our body language. All right, Jenna, you have a question?
Yeah, so I actually had a family member read White Fragility recently, and they're a very like empathetic person, and so they were like, whenever I'm crying, like whenever I'm learning about all of this stuff, like why is that not okay? And so I was trying to like explain that it's what you do after that, you know, but I don't know if that's like right in how I was like thinking about that.
I think it's also why, the reason why you're crying. Like I've done facilitations and conversations around the history of oppression. When people realize like the systems that were created that still oppress people, they have to cry and like go off video, right? And that's just becoming aware. So there isn't anything wrong with you becoming aware. When we pop that bubble that you've lived in, you're like, oh, I live in my privilege bubble. And it's like, boop, it's been popped. And now you're crying because now you feel all the oppression of the world hitting you. It's the tears in which you want to then become a victim when you acknowledge the lived experience of people of color. That is when tears are not okay. Because we never had the comfort of being in a bubble for it to one day magically get popped, where it seems like a term Amy uses with me all the time, oppressive Olympics, where you're kind of have this competing victimization, like who is more the victim here? And that's when the tears aren't okay. Because it isn't you tearing up because, wow, this is a shock to my system. All of these systems of oppression have existed and I've never seen them, right? It's more so like, boo-hoo, woe is me. I have lived this way and now I've been awoken, and I want other folks around me to feel sorry for my existence and my privilege. And that is where it's very hard for people of color to, one, articulate that with not getting very irate, because we're dealing with our own trauma. And so then it's like, you want me to sympathize with your trauma and you just realize my trauma exists? Like, what? Like, how does that happen? And so, yeah, I guess I kind of answered your question. Okay. Are there any other questions? Does anyone want to share now that we've kind of dived in? Oh, a comment?
Go ahead, Dana. We can't hear you if you're speaking, Dana. Oh, can't get my microphone to work. Sorry, no worries. If you want to put it in the chat, we would love it. And while we're waiting for her to put that comment in the chat, I'll talk for a second so you can get enough time to type it in. And Jenna, kind of piggybacking off what Stephanie said, you know, like I was doing a training, we were doing the Promise to Protect training in Denver at the Four Winds American Indian Council. And one of the women in the audience burst into tears and stood up and was like, I just feel so sorry for you guys. And we were teaching about organizing in Indigenous territory, fossil fuel projects through Indigenous land, and all of the oppression and everything that comes with the murdered Indigenous women and all of the things that along with that. And so I just wanted to give an example of like those kind of like white tears off of what Stephanie said, like it's how the tears are used and in what situation, like her bursting into tears and pitying this group of people. And, you know, my Indigenous organizers from South Dakota was just, it was really heavy for all of the organizers. And we all had to kind of take a step back and, you know, that was a lot. And then having to use our emotional labor to make her feel better because she's the one crying about what she feels towards Native people, it's exhausting. All right, Dana, are you sure? I'm waiting. Okay.
So like, if that person, like if that woman had like never heard about anything before, and you know, like she's just coming aware of this, like in that space, what should that person do? Like, how do they, you know?
Oh, shit. I think the most important part to pull out from that is like, we don't want your pity.
Mm-hmm.
Like we want you, you know, that quote that Stephanie said earlier about if your liberation is bound up with mine, I have that on my wall above my desk and I look at it every single morning and try to remember that no matter what space I'm in, as, you know, as a half Native, half Hungarian person that I bring that, you know, binding my liberation with someone else's. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I guess I'm just like, how do you, maybe like for me personally, I am already like I'm a white person, you know, so how do I express to other people that I know that like, these are the things that are happening, and like if you're emotional, I acknowledge that, but like you need to take it a step farther than that, you know, because you can't just be like, I don't acknowledge that you're feeling about this, because like we want people to feel, to get them to do actions.
Right. And I would say, like in Amy's example, if you, and this is where we can like this could be a consistent session just going into ally and accomplice, but like if you are in a predominantly person of color space and you are going in there as an ally and you have absorbed a whole bunch of information that has popped your bubble and you're like, oh my gosh, I'm about to break down. Crying in that space, as long as you're not taking up space in this space of people of color in a way that prevents them from moving forward. And it's like that three-legged race I was talking about, how often allies sometimes in processing their own acknowledgement of these systems of oppression, they start wanting to run in different directions, right? Which is kind of what I heard is what happened in this event, is like her acknowledgement and pity for the group that she was in, then kind of derailed and impacted their goal of the event, right? Which really isn't very helpful if you're supposed to be an ally, right? And so if you're in a place that's predominantly people of color, I would say don't take up a lot of space. And if you're processing trauma and you feel like you need to vent, I wouldn't recommend yelling it out to a group of people of color. Personally, I don't feel like that's a good recommendation. I would say leave the room if you need to process. Like I've been in some trainings where there was a lot of intense videos of people of color being beaten and oppressed, and I had to step out, right? So I wouldn't like deflect from the training. That's where you have to be conscious of your privilege too and respect people's existence. And I often feel like as white people are unpacking your privilege, it's often hard to see how you unpacking your privilege in certain spaces is really trauma and triggering for people of color. Like, I really don't have time to have you to unpack your great-grandfather being a part of the Confederacy when I'm trying to run a training around implicit bias. Like, we can dive into it a little bit, but that's where you need to go home, unlearn, unpack, and maybe reach out to someone outside of that space. But if it's a space where it's a lot of white folks, and there is a facilitator that's a person of color who's doing an intense training that's going into systems of oppression, and you feel like your bubble has been bursted and you're in a space of your peers, it may be better received, and we're all human, so it's not like 100%, but it may be better received in that space to vent and release, because the burden of the folks who have to console you aren't people who've been living this oppression. And that burden is being shared with your white peers. And so that's often why I suggest really when we dive into these trainings in person to be able to allow safe spaces where folks can still kind of let their bubbles be bursted and release it without a person of color having to hear you acknowledge for the first time that racism exists. Because there's only so many times you hear someone say that where you get to your breaking point because it's our lived everyday experience. But I definitely appreciate you asking that, Jenna, because this is the reason why we do these series, is to have these conversations and unpack with folks, because they don't teach this in school. Like, this isn't a curriculum on implicit bias. So. Someone said, since agriculture happened, we started becoming separate from our tribal ancestries and started to have cities with mixed cultures. Oh, wait, did I miss the whole? I did, I'm sorry. Okay, so Dana shared that she really enjoyed the point on becoming conscious of the programming that has been bestowed on us since the beginning. Deep-rooted in our DNA as tribes, we were amongst our own. Even in animal kingdoms, they usually stay together. It's natural instincts to be alert of something outside your tribe. It's ingrained in our DNA as survival mechanisms. Being conscious is the key to addressing racism. In scripture, not that I'm religious, forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do. Thank you very much for that. The whole conscious part is key because a lot of us were raised by folks who have bias, and we repeat that bias. Some of it's conscious, some of it's unconscious. And so we constantly have to become more aware of what we say and what we do. And so in this next slide, this was just a slide before positionality. This is more so just a reminder because we're about to go into communication. And so when we communicate with people, we communicate them from our positions. Some positions they see, because those are the positions that we can't hide. But then there's those positions that they can't see, right? That may be how much you make, that may be if you're a homeowner, that may be if you are a native English speaker, that may be your immigration status. Those are those things that they may not be able to see, but you react and behave because of that positionality. So in the next section, we're going to go into communication just briefly. And this is somewhere where I just want you to be honest because we're building this list as we go and we can't create a list of no-nos without people adding to the list. So we can go to the next slide. So often in times when we communicate with folks, we tend to use language that we are blind to how it's offensive. Amy brought up a wonderful one, or not wonderful, but she brought up a good example of one yesterday around Colorado Native. Now, does anyone know why Colorado Native may be offensive?
It probably only applies if you're of a tribe. And most people that use it just mean that they've lived here all their life, not that they're really a native.
Yeah,
Correct.
Just because you were born in Colorado doesn't mean that you are a native person of Colorado.
Yes. And so that is like a term that even an ally could use, right? And they are just unconscious that they like offended folks in the room because you're like, oh, well, I'm a Colorado native, lived here all my life. Originally my family's from New York, you know, and they'll just do their whole spiel and it's like, they're not even aware. So some other language no-nos are using past tense language to refer to indigenous folks. I was under training a week ago, maybe 2 weeks ago, and it was something like, I became conscious of the times when I have done that. And I had to become aware that I repeat what I hear other people say. And I had been in a lot of spaces where folks were introduced indigenous folks using past tense language. And I was on this training and they were just like, no, like you doing that is very offensive. And the example that was given, if you think of someone was introducing people of color or people who are descendants of slaves into an event and they were speaking of them as if they didn't exist and their people didn't exist and they spoke on everything in past tense, how would that make you feel before they introduced you? And I was like, wow, I actually would be pretty pissed. Like I wouldn't want to introduce them. I wouldn't want to be part of the event anymore. And many of our allies don't acknowledge that that's harmful. So some other language no-nos. This is a big one for me when I work with people of color, Black women, especially in white elder women allies. Do not call a Black elder or an elder in general, girl, boy, or child. Okay, like do not. I have had to pull some older ladies off of each other because you can't. Someone has spent their whole life fighting against a status that has tried to always oppress them into not having power. And so even the subtle, accidental, girl, if she has not explicitly said that's okay with you, one, the stereotypical, and two, is this very disrespectful. And so girl, boy, child, language, no. You people, you're kind, you are smart fora, fill in the blank, or you speak well. And so if there are any that you have been told or you've heard or that you corrected someone that you want to get out there, please put it in the chat, because I can add these to the trainings in the future, and it helps make our work build upon each other.
I would like to say the whole idea of respect. You run into the younger people with their young children, and they will introduce you. I'd like you to meet June. You know, it was something that we never did, and I do understand things are changing. But when you run into a person and they have all this gray hair like I have, and you're going to introduce me to your 4-year-old as June, it's so disrespectful. I still find that very disrespectful.
Thank you for that. I'm going to type that in here while I'm waiting. Does anyone else want to share anything?
Yeah, I thought of some other ideas with this. Noticing we have to get out of the habit of saying discovered America or discovered South America. We really mean rediscovered. And sometimes we would read the distinction between civilized people and non, or there was this goal of civilizing people, and what that really meant was probably killing a lot of people and forcibly integrating people into a certain culture.
Yeah, discovered is in history is a trigger word for a lot of folks. Civilized cultures, how they define civilized, and that's based on like white supremacy culture, which we're going to go into in a few slides here. Does anyone else have anything to share about language no-nos that you just feel like would be helpful to have to this growing list?
Please look at me comments.
Oh, okay, I just saw that. What are you? Where are you really from? Calling women dear sweetheart. Yes. Baby cakes. Oh, yes. Okay. All right. Yeah, we can move on. So when it comes to communication in print, here are just some no-nos. Since most of us do work in the space or we organize events, get consent. Don't take pictures of people of color and just post them, especially if it's some traumatic event. I know everyone likes to give views and likes and stuff, but please get consent. If you really are an ally, get consent. Now, if it's a situation where the person is in a place where they can get consent because they're being like harassed by police, then obviously trying to interrupt them like, yo, can I post this may not be the time. But to acknowledge that what makes you different than just being an actor to an ally is that you will be intentional in getting consent, because how you make people of color feel matters in your actions. You're not just trying to use people of color for the likes. If you are unsure, ask. If you feel like something is not a good idea, ask. That is what Gucci should have did when they came up with this turtleneck idea. If they should have asked, because if they would have polled, if they would have sent it out, people would have said bad idea, okay? And often it happens because we work in silos, and we work in silos of our peers, and unless our silos are diverse, we can make biased decisions. And this Gucci turtleneck was a decision that was made from a space of privilege. Use positive images of people of color. I don't know how many of you are receiving literature because it's voting time. I always do, and I guess they know my family's Black, so they always send me pictures from the party with Black people on it. And I dislike when they show families that don't look well kept, that represent families of color, if the children's hair aren't done, or if the background looks a certain way. And it's just really important that we need to use positive images when we post pictures of people of color. And then consider the trigger and the impact that you will have on people of color when you post and print and create things. And it's not about appropriation of culture. All right, we can move to this. Yep. So what can white people do? First step is recognition. You need to admit that racism exists. And when you go into having conversations with white peers, white allies, or just white people that you just have to interact with because somehow they're part of your family, and you're like, I need to have this conversation with you. I have a racist uncle. Me and him bump heads all the time. And the first step is recognition. So that's where you need to start in the beginning of the conversation. You need to acknowledge that people of different cultures and races are not treated equally, and they do not have the same opportunities. Pay attention to what racism looks like in your context. You need to acknowledge that people of different cultures and races are not treated equally. Okay, pay attention to what racism looks like in your context. You need to think about your social group, your colleagues, your neighbors. Who do you plan with? Who do you meet with? Notice who's around you at social events, even though right now we can't. Notice how people are treated. Just start paying attention to who is and who isn't around you. And then analyze and reflect. Now is the perfect time more than ever to spend this time reflecting on your lived experience and who your social makeup actually is made up of. So that when we come out of this, you can be very intentional about who you want to make up your social dynamic. And if you really are an ally, everyone shouldn't look like you. Let's just be honest. All right, next slide. Pass it back to you, Amy.
Yep. So I love this slide because it really like the imagery is really powerful on getting to the roots of climate change. And that is primarily what Stephanie and I organize around, is the climate movement. And something that's really important to both of us and why we do this work, specifically in justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, is because what upholds the roots of climate change and the fossil fuel industry and everything that it encompasses is patriarchy, colonialism, capitalism, and white supremacy. And until we address those things collectively, then we can take down the most powerful industry in the world, and that's the fossil fuel industry, because it is upheld by these things. And a big step is to bring into the climate movement why we're here and what we're here for. And if we're not stepping up to bring to the front the knowledge that climate justice is social justice and social justice is climate justice, then we won't accomplish anything. And these trainings are definitely not, to convince people that racism exists. It's about education and skills and abilities, and to share knowledge. Knowledge sharing is one of our most powerful tools that we can use, and to give that to other people so that they can take leadership roles, both individually and together as a movement, in challenging racism and other inequities in the environmental movement. And this includes within our own organizations and breaking down those walls and those systems of oppression that have occurred in the climate movement for so long. So many of these organizations are extremely white-based, and until they start handing over the power to people of color, this movement can't move forward. And so that's why we do these trainings, because it means a lot to both of us, like a lot. So it's not, again, to lash out at white folks. It's just to give a refresher on oppression and how it shows up in the movement, because it shows up a lot. The white savior complex shows up a ton working in frontline communities and with communities of color. Big green organizations think they can swoop in and save everything, and oh, we have all the solutions, when really they should be uplifting the voices in our communities. They should be putting the power in the hands of the people, not in the hands of the big green movement for social clout. And so this online training was, to acknowledge the roles and responsibilities that white people have to combat racism and oppression. And we are very grateful for all of you being here with us tonight to help break down those systems of oppression.
Yes, thank you everyone for attending this training with us. Here, for those of you who can't see, we have 2 upcoming trainings that I will be facilitating tomorrow. One is on micro and macro oppression. We dive deeper into more of the systems of oppression, what they look like, and how they show up in our everyday existence. It is a part of our Lunch and Learn series. It starts at 10 a.m. Mountain Time, and I will send the link out in the chat. And for those of you that signed up with us just straight through Facebook, if you want to receive email follow-up from us, please put your email in the chat. And if you're like, hey, I can't access the chat, you can just stay on a little bit after, and Amy and I will get your email. It was a little wonky with our link this time. And tomorrow evening, there's a training that I'm co-facilitating with Marnice, who's on the call now, and it's how to show up in frontline communities. And that will be tomorrow from 4 to 5 p.m. And so if you're interested in either one of these and hopping on, there is a longer series that these 2 trainings were a part of, where we dive into anti-oppression and anti-racism. And it's about 9 trainings, and implicit bias was just a fragment of it, and ally versus accomplice was just a fragment of it. And if you feel like this was very helpful for you, this may be a series that you want to continue to hop in on. And so we can move to the next slide. Okay, perfect. And so this is just our pluses and deltas. We're always building these trainings out. It's really important for me to get you all's feedback, because I can't do this work without you, and we all have to unlearn and relearn together. So if you would feel free, if you can share pluses and deltas, things you like and key learnings in the chat, or if you just want to say it out loud, Amy and I will type it up.
And just so everybody knows, I am collecting email addresses and putting them in here for both Stephanie and I, so we can follow up. Yes, and content too. Yeah, absolutely. Go howl outside, Hedima. Love you, Mama. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for coming. Thank you, Jenna, for your message in the chat. And we can take deltas, like, I'm okay with constructive criticism.
Same. I got it, Mia. I put it in there. But she said, plus to facilitators committed, passionate, and open. We appreciate that.
Thank you. That's real. Thank you for that, Mia. That has been a feedback in the past where some of the sessions that we really dive deep, we actually make them private. So that could be something that, like, if you all see a need for that, for me, I'm still building out what this program will look like since our lives have changed. So if you feel like you would like something that is private where we could dive more in and do self-share, I have done that and it was very helpful.
Thank you guys so much for sticking with us for 2 weeks. We appreciate you. And we're going to do more of these. Stephanie and I are going to plan out a good training series, and I'm really excited about it. I love facilitating with her.
Thank you. I really want to do one that's like, I don't know what I'm going to call it, but I want to do someone that's like family members or allies can submit their family to go into the training. So it's like for your crazy uncle type of training. And we just put all the crazy uncles on one Zoom call and we just unpack this. One, I feel like it would just be super hilarious and kind of fun and traumatic and triggering and just healing all in the same process. But I feel like a lot of us have folks we will want to submit. All right, well, I just want to respect everyone's time. And if you wanted to stay on to ask any other questions, I'll be here. But if you want to hop off, I definitely understand.
And I'm going to stop the recording. So thanks,
Okay.
guys.